Okay, so welcome everybody to the fourth, I think, MarSocSci Australia seminar in our seminar series. First of all, I'd just like to acknowledge that today we're meeting across various Aboriginal lands, seas and waterways online. And I acknowledge with deep respect the traditional owners of these lands. I pay my respects to elders past and present, and to the many Aboriginal people that did not make elder status, and to the Aboriginal community that continue to care for country. So today I am super excited to present Amy Diedrich. Is that how you pronounce it, Amy?
It's not, you can pronounce it however you like. Diedrich, whatever.
Thank you.
I don't even know.
So Amy is the Deputy Director of the Centre for Sustainable Tropical Fisheries and Aquaculture and the leader of the Livelihoods Lab at James Cook University. Her research interests relate broadly to the human dimensions of conservation and natural resource management, with an emphasis on coastal and marine environments. And specifically, they include exploring how rural, resource-dependent communities in the tropics respond to social and environmental change, and how this affects their ability to maintain sustainable livelihoods. She emphasises applied interdisciplinary approaches to her research, a woman after my own heart, and her research spans the Caribbean, Latin America, the Mediterranean, Southeast Asia, and the Indo-Pacific. And so, Amy, I will pass over to you.
Great, thanks very much, Karen. I'm going to share my screen now. Hang on. All right. So thanks everyone for being here today. I'm glad there's a small audience because I'm much less nervous about delivering this presentation, and looking forward to sharing some of my research with you. So today I'm going to be talking about a project that I've been involved in over the last 6 years or so on small-scale fisheries, livelihoods and sports fishing tourism in Papua New Guinea. But I'm going to start just with a little bit of background about my research interests and the sort of rationale for doing this type of work so that you sort of understand where I'm coming from, I guess. And one key question that I've been very interested in recent years is how can we achieve better livelihood outcomes from change and development in small-scale fishing communities? And my work over the years, since I started my PhD, in fact, focuses specifically on 3 drivers of change that are currently dominating international policy agendas, offering potential avenues for small-scale fishing communities to reduce their vulnerability to global threats such as climate change and fisheries decline. And these, as you can see on the screen, are tourism, conservation, and small-scale aquaculture. And a common theme or rationale across the introduction of these activities into small-scale fishing communities is the idea of alternative livelihoods. And the perceived logic behind the alternative livelihoods narrative is that if you have excess pressure on fisheries as a result of too much fishing, then if you provide people with an alternative way of making money, then they will engage with that activity and reduce pressure on fisheries, while also addressing broader issues of poverty and also building their resilience to changes as a result of becoming more diversified in their income generating activity. So, but the reality is that these programs often don't really work. So tourism often comes hand in hand with conservation, the establishment of marine protected areas, and behind that there's the sort of oversimplified idea that when people stop fishing, when their fishing rights are restricted, then they can be trained to become tour guides or small business owners, and that they will make money in that way and learn to respect protecting the environment because they're making money off of it via tourism and not fishing. And similarly, the small-scale aquaculture narrative is around supplementing wild fisheries as a food source, which of course is very, very important. But again, there tends to be a sort of oversimplified assumption in some cases that people will simply adopt small-scale aquaculture, and that this will solve a lot of problems. But it's really a lot more complicated, and this is reflected in the fact that a lot of these initiatives fail to meet their intended objectives. So I'm interested in exploring how to make them more effective. So why small-scale fisheries? I know I'm preaching to the converted here, so I won't spend heaps of time here, but obviously small-scale fisheries are important because of the large proportion of people that are engaged in them worldwide. The fact that they are, the people that engage in them are largely from less developed countries. About half are women, many of them are in Asia, which is obviously a sort of strategic research area for Australia. And around 5.8 million, so close to a huge proportion of these people engaged in small-scale fisheries are on very, very low incomes. And where this is not a great measure of poverty or well-being by any stretch, it does kind of give you an idea of the potential subsistence level and dependence of people on small-scale fisheries. And also small-scale fisheries provide a huge amount of protein. They have really big nutritional value for low-income countries and small island developing states. And on top of that, they actually contribute to about half of the world catch. So they're important from ecological, social, and health perspectives, among others, and cultural perspectives. And not much is really known about them or how to manage them. It's actually a relatively new research field. So these guidelines that were established or brought out by the FAO in 2015 is the first piece of international policy that deals specifically with trying to understand how to better manage small-scale fisheries. And they were produced in the context of food security and poverty eradication, which corresponds with the data that I just showed you. And I'll draw your attention to Article 6.8, which is the part of the guidelines that addresses the right for people to have work. And this quote says that small-scale fishing communities should equitably benefit from developments such as community-based tourism and small-scale responsible aquaculture. So these are the only two alternative livelihoods that receive explicit mention in this policy document, which I think is a very clear indication of this very strong narrative behind these activities being the sort of savior of small-scale fishing communities in the livelihood space. So moreover, this report that was recently published by the World Bank cites tourism as one of the greatest transformational opportunities in the Pacific. And the infographic on the right presents some pretty alarming figures representing the potential influx of people and revenue into the Pacific over the next 20 years. And whether these anticipated changes present opportunities or threats to small-scale fishing communities depends largely on how people respond to and adapt to these changes. And a key aspect of this is whether local people actually feel confident or able to engage with these activities. And this is a focus, the main central focus of the work that I'm going to be showing you today. So briefly, before we move on to the actual project, for the purpose of context, it's really important to note that tourism hasn't really taken off in Papua New Guinea and in many of the more isolated parts of the Pacific, where other industries that may be considered more destructive have proliferated, such as oil palm logging, gas, and so forth, mining. And these, of course, have really broad implications for small-scale fishery livelihoods. They have broad implications for tourism development. And although this, looking at the impacts of these is outside the scope of this presentation and this research, we will revisit the relevance of this point and the fact that approaching any alternative livelihood initiative that's small scale, like tourism or small scale aquaculture, isn't really going to work unless you take into account these broader activities in the landscape. All right, so moving on to the project. I'm not going to show you this video because for some reason the quality of videos on Zoom is terrible and I haven't figured out how to make it right, but you can always Google it on YouTube. But I will use it to show you a picture of a black bass. So our project in PNG was called the Black Bass Project, and it looked at sports fishing for sustainable livelihoods and conservation in PNG. And it was funded by the National Fisheries Authority and the Australian Centre, the NFA of Papua New Guinea, and the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research, ACR. And this here is a black bass. It's ginormous. I think that was, at the time, was one of the biggest ones that was ever caught. Someone's now surpassed that. But they're also known for being an incredible fighting fish. And this fish, it's only found in PNG. There are other iterations of black bass found in other places, but this fish actually featured on the American series called River Monsters. So it's known for being a sort of really tough fish, and it attracts all kinds of sports fishers from all over the world. So the two questions, so this project was a larger interdisciplinary project that looked at how sports fishing tourism could contribute both to conservation from an ecological perspective and also to livelihoods. And so my role in the project was to focus on the social side of things, but there was also economists working with us and fish ecologists and so forth. So it was a big interdisciplinary study. But the questions that I was interested in is what factors influence people's perceptions of how easy or difficult it would be to engage in sports fishing tourism. So coming back to this idea of, well, you know, if it's going to be an opportunity, if it's going to produce benefits, then people need to actually be willing to and able to engage. And also, what is the context of change within which sports fishing tourism is developing? So looking at the sort of broader implications and where tourism fits into this trajectory of change in communities, because there tends to be a very sort of myopic view sometimes in projects that are trying to promote a particular livelihood. So our project took place in West New Britain here in the two stars. And the White Star, there were 2 communities, and the Black Star, there was 1 community. So we had 3 study communities overall. And these were associated with sports fishing lodges. And I should mention that sports fishing tourism in PNG and tourism in general isn't a huge industry, but there is this notion that sports fishing tourism is going to develop over there, and a desire and also an expectation. And so the National Fisheries Authority of PNG was actually the organization that came up with the idea of having this project, because they want to develop a sports fishery management plan. So to actually manage sports fish as a fishery, which I think is quite interesting and innovative. So this research was intended to feed into that plan. So yeah, very few operators at the time that we did this work. So the data we collected were, we did a community household survey, and our sample size was 157, and that actually represented 97% of the households. So our response rate was really, really high. And this had a lot to do with, I suppose, the longevity of the project, the fact that we spent quite a lot of time in the community as a team, going back and forth multiple times, and we engaged them from the very beginning, even before we actually implemented the survey, to help develop questions around things that would be of value to them. And they were also engaged in the data interpretation, and we presented results back to them and so forth. So it was a very engaged process, and we worked, so I've got something weird popping up on my screen that I need to get rid of. Go away. Okay, sorry about that. All right, so the other reason that we had quite high response rate was that we worked with local people in each of the villages who helped us actually do the data collection. And the data collection was led by Lena, who's down here in the middle picture, with a notepad, and she's from National Fisheries Authority and was really instrumental in helping us as well. So we did the survey, and then a year later, actually, when we went back with the results of the survey, we did a participatory mapping exercise and some focus group interviews. And these were with 6 different groups. So 2 groups from each community, 1 group that was comprised of women and 1 group that was comprised of men. And we sort of stratified the members of the focus groups to make sure that we had representation of different age groups and different sort of main livelihood activities. And the participatory mapping So the focus group interviews was about asking people to create a vision for the future of their community. And I'll come back to that. It'll make more sense when I show you the results. And the participatory mapping was around looking at their access to market, their access to basic infrastructure, and also to map their fishing grounds and determine if there was any type of conflict between their fishing activities and the potential development and current activity of black bass sports fishing. So as I said, there was quite a bit of community engagement involved in the project as well. These are just a few pictures of us presenting back to the community. We had local people from the villages and also from the National Fisheries Authority helping us collect data. And we engaged quite a bit with the kids. We brought lots of supplies for the schools. And we did this one thing that I thought was really great, that I stole the idea from a colleague of mine that some of you know, Pete Waldy, who also works in PNG. And what we did was we brought a projector into the community with a white sheet, and we did a sort of cinema night for the kids. And it wasn't just the kids that came, but so in this particular picture on the left, we're showing them Frozen, which I admit is a pretty ridiculous movie choice for a bunch of kids in PNG, but they loved it, and it was a really fun activity and a nice way to give back to the community for engaging with us and being so accommodating. All right, so in the community survey, the household survey, these are the main categories of data that we collected, and I'm not going to have time to go through all of them, but this will just give you an idea of sort of what we were looking at. So we were interested in perceptions of quality of life and the factors that influence those, perceptions of change, so what changes have occurred in the community, what do they anticipate will happen in the future, and this kind of fed into the focus group exercise that was about projecting desired change into the future. And I'll add here that an approach that I take to a lot of my research around alternative livelihoods, even though it might be focused on the potential for tourism or aquaculture or so forth to take off, is I don't just focus on that. I try to place that activity within a broader context of change so that I can understand where it fits into the bigger picture and how important it is in relation to other changes that are happening in the community. We also got quite a few measures of social capital. We looked at people's livelihoods to understand them more, what they were engaging with, what was important, and we emphasized understanding more about their fishing practices. We looked at perceptions of fisheries resources and the impacts upon them. And I know I just brushed over social capital, but I'm going to come back to that, which is why I did that. We looked at perceptions of tourism and then also the usual demographic variables. So now I'll present to you some of the results. Not all of them, but some of them. And this is Lena with all of her surveys. She was actually a student at JCU and then went to the National Fisheries Authority, and she's from SEPIC originally, and yeah, she's awesome. She really helped with everything, including writing our paper. All right, so the livelihood context for the villages, just to give you a bit of context before we go into the more detailed results. So across all the villages, fishing and growing crops was the most important livelihood for them, and the majority of households are very close to 50% subsistence, so largely subsistence community. Fish was the most important source of income in all the villages, and black bass were not a target species in any village, so not much potential for competition over this fish as a food source. But what they were targeting were some of these larger pelagic species that can be very popular amongst sports fishers, such as red emperor, mackerel, trevally, tuna, and so forth. And so I suppose worth keeping this in mind, that if the industry were to grow and extend out into these marine species, that there might be the potential for conflict. It would be something that would need to be explored and addressed. The lack of infrastructure and limited access to market was a universal challenge for all these communities. So the ones that were off to the west were little islands offshore with only accessible by boat. One of them was about an hour offshore in a pretty fast boat, and the other was even further. And actually being able to, once you got to shore, there was no paved road or anything like that. So really, really isolated. And the other one that was to the east, also very isolated, no paved road within any reasonable distance. And then also from Kimby, it was a 4.5-hour boat ride in a major boat. So isolated communities. And the other thing we found from the participatory mapping exercise was that there was no conflict or overlap between local fishing and sports fishing tourism. Again, local fishing tended to happen in the marine area, and the black bass live in the estuarine areas and sometimes even further upriver. So perceptions of fish abundance now compared with 5 years ago. This is important because understanding what people's stance is on the state of their resources is an important predictor of whether or not they're going to actually believe that taking some kind of action to conserve them is important. And if it is, then you need to understand why they think those fisheries resources are declining. Is there any agency? Do they understand that it's something to do with humans, or do they attribute it all to outside problems? And you can see here that 2 of the communities perceived that their fisheries resources had declined in the last 5 years, although not a huge amount. 5 is sort of, it hasn't really changed. So Vese was, practically negligible. And then one of them considered that the fisheries resources had increased. And it's interesting to look at the rationales or the reasons behind this. And again, these were open-ended questions, so we didn't sort of feed them any of these ideas. We just asked them, what do you think is affecting it? And then we coded the results. So you can see that both the ones that perceived declining fisheries resources considered that overfishing was an issue, but not overfishing in the sense that too many people were fishing, but just that people were using destructive fishing techniques. And then Somilani, which was a very, I suppose it was a really interesting community. They had a pretty different vision to the other ones, and we'll come back to that when I show you the focus group data. But they considered that their resources had improved because they've been involved in conservation, and also because they actively decided not to engage in oil palm plantations, which is something that some of the communities nearby had done and suffered some consequences. And interestingly, Vese was one of them, but they did not cite oil palm as being a reason that their fisheries resources had declined, even though the Somilani people believed that it had. And then finally, in Baja, they also attributed logging to be an issue. So here we're seeing these sort of larger scale activities in the landscape playing into this sort of the livelihoods and fisheries dynamics of the communities, which indicates, that it's an important consideration to take a look at the bigger picture. And so this is another important bit to give you a bit of background. We asked people if they were interested in becoming involved in tourism, and I'm showing you this for 2 reasons. The first reason is, obviously you can see that most people said yes, and the next piece of analysis that I'm going to show you around finding out what factors influence people's perceptions of whether or not they felt they could engage in tourism was based off of this larger sample of people who said yes, because obviously it's not relevant to ask people who don't know or don't want to. So we had a decent sample size for this. But another important thing that this illustrates is that when presented, when an isolated community with very few economic opportunities is presented with a potential opportunity to make money or engage in something else, the chances are that interest is going to be really, really high. And this is, it's an okay place to start, but it can't serve as your only justification for actually implementing a new activity or pushing it forward, because it's a lot more nuanced than that. People here are obviously engaged in wanting to make more money, wanting to be involved in more things, but might not know the implications of what that means if they haven't experienced much tourism. So it's a lot more complicated than just using this as a rationale for going ahead with an initiative. And I've seen this happen heaps, and it's very overly simplistic. All right, so that's a bit of the sort of context. And now I'm going to move on to our analysis, our modeling of looking at the factors that influence people's perceptions of how easy or difficult it would be to engage in sports fishing tourism. And again, this is kind of coming back to this idea that if these activities are going to be beneficial, then people need to actually feel confident to engage and they need to engage. And this is just one little piece of the puzzle. Just because they feel confident that they can engage, it doesn't mean that it's going to work out, but it's an important thing to look at. And this work has been published in the article that I've cited below if you want to learn more about it. So in order to answer this question, we used data from the survey, and we used the capital assets framework from the Sustainable Livelihoods approach to organize it. And we basically, our dependent variable was the perceived ease of tourism involvement, and our independent variables were 5 composite measures of the capital assets. So the sustainable livelihood approach, which I think most of you are probably familiar with, basically one element of it is that it suggests that people's livelihoods are influenced by their access to these different capital assets. And so these measures, as I said, were composite. They were based on a combination of subjective and objective measures from the survey and elsewhere. And given the limited access to financial, human, and physical capitals that were characterized in our communities, and also based on other research that I've been engaged in, we expected that social capital would have the strongest influence on our dependent variable. And we use classification tree analysis to explore these relationships. So I'm going to show you the first classification tree that we produced, and it's an oversimplified version for this presentation, but as I said, if you want to get more details, you can look in the paper. But so this bubble represents our dependent variable, the perceived ease of becoming more involved in sports fishing tourism. And you can see that, as expected, social capital had the biggest influence. So people who perceived higher levels of social capital in the community felt that it would be easier to become involved in sports fishing tourism. So the next most influential variable was actually financial capital. And this only applied to the group who thought it would be harder and perceived less financial capital. And those people, if they had higher financial capital, they actually thought it would be harder to be involved. And we'll come back to why this could be the case a little bit later. And then also natural capital had an influence, but again, it's a very small one at this point in the model. But in this case, people who perceived that they were more satisfied with their access to natural capital felt more able to engage in sports fishing tourism. But again, this is a subset of the original group who felt that there was lower social capital and who also had lower financial capital. All right, so because I mentioned to you before that the capital asset variables were composite variables, because social capital was most important, we decided to run a second model and try to look at the disaggregated influence of the social capital variables on our dependent variable. And the disaggregated variables were comprised of perceptions of trust and reciprocity, satisfaction with family and friends, relationship with other villagers, satisfaction with leadership, and people's social networks. And what we found was that reciprocity had the strongest influence on the dependent variables. So people who perceived that people in their community were more generous and that reciprocity was strong felt more confident that they could engage in sports fishing tourism. And from that group, they also perceived that if they were more, those who were more satisfied with leadership in the community also felt more confident in engaging. So to summarize those results, the people who are most confident in their ability to engage in tourism were more likely to feel more connected and satisfied with their community and relationships. They were more likely to believe reciprocity and leadership was strong in the community, have lower financial capital, and be more satisfied with their access to natural capital. Now, as I mentioned before, the relationship here with lower financial capital and natural capital it was lower down in the model. It's a little bit tricky to interpret with the data that we have. But if you look at some of the literature around people adopting alternative livelihoods, there is some evidence that people who have higher financial capital may either have less incentive to engage, or they may also have less time to engage because they're busy obtaining financial capital through other means. And the same goes with access to natural capital, which in this case, if they were more satisfied with their ability to access natural capital, this could mean that they felt that they perhaps had more time to dedicate to another activity because they weren't busy trying to get food on the table, or as busy. So both of these variables feed into this narrative of time. And we'll come back to this, but one of the problems, I guess, with some approaches to alternative livelihoods is this assumption that people will just be able to adopt a new activity and without considering how busy they might be and the fact that they just will not have time, or they might not be willing to take the risk and forego other income or food generating activities to try to engage. And you can even apply that to your own life. Most of us have full-time jobs, and if someone came to us and said, hey, do you want to try this really risky venture? You might not have time or inclination to do it at the expense of what you're already doing. Okay, so moving on to the community's visions for the future development. So this was the future visions exercise that we did for the focus groups, which I thought was really, really interesting. It's the first time I've ever done this, and I really, really enjoyed it. And so what we did was as I said, we had focus groups of men and women in each community, and we gave them an exercise. We said, ask them to just go away and have a chat amongst themselves. There were no researchers present, and to come up with a list of 5 things that they would like to see, changes that they would like to see in their community in the next 5 to 10 years. And we said, think big, think that money is not an issue. Just imagine if you could change your community, what would it look like? And I think this is really important because if there is an initiative to sort of introduce a new activity into a community, it's really important to know if and where this fits in with where they want to go in the future. Because that's going to play into a big way in whether or not it's successful and whether or not it's adopted and whether or not it's sustained and so forth. And we ended up with 3 very distinct development models from the 3 different communities. So men and women actually had pretty similar visions, which was good. And the 3 models, we called them basic needs, growth, and sustainable development. And I'm just going to snap into 2 of them. So the basic needs one was really around, we need sanitation, we need schools, we need roads, and so forth. And all of the communities, to some extent, or they all needed that, and they all cited that. But the one that was basic needs was very much just focused on that. Whereas the Vese model down here on the left that we called growth, this island was a tiny little island just covered in houses. Can't even imagine another house going on there. And what they wanted was more boats. So they wanted every single person on the island to have a boat so that they could fish more and take more stuff to market. They wanted water supply and aid posts and modern houses. But another really interesting thing is that they wanted to actually expand the island. So they wanted to build a seawall and divert sand and actually make the island bigger and build new houses. So a real focus on growth. Whereas Somilani, we called this growth vision, or this vision, sustainable development. And this is a picture of what the men came up with. And they actually came back and said that education was the only thing that they needed to achieve everything, because everything hinged off of education. And this community was interesting because they actually had, one of their community members had gone away and gotten a PhD in sustainable development and come back to the community and taught them a whole bunch of stuff. And that person was not there at the time, but they showed me his house and talked about the massive influence that he had over them. So that's why they sort of saw this really big value in education. And they wanted, amongst a permanent marketplace, they also explicitly said they wanted sustainable development. And when I asked them what they meant by this, they said that tourism was a really good example of sustainable development, because the tourists would just come to the village. They were talking about sports fishing tourism. They would admire their culture. They would play with their fish and then just leave them alone, give them some money and go away without doing any damage. And that this was the perfect model of sustainable development. And they wanted to see that develop more. And they were diversifying into lots of different things to try to promote that. They also wanted to learn better fishing techniques. So even though they thought that their fisheries resources were improving, they recognized that they needed to understand better how to manage their fisheries sustainably. So they were asking for more information about that, and also information about how to manage environmental impacts of different activities in the landscape. So even though they'd already taken measures to address that, they wanted more information and more knowledge. And obviously they also wanted better transportation by sea and road, which was something that all the villagers talked about. All right, so I'm going to wrap up with addressing two questions. And one was the summary of our sort of research project and asking whether sports fishing tourism can support sustainable livelihoods in PNG based on our results. And then I'll end with just a teeny little soapbox about why tourism alternative livelihoods initiatives often fail in the Pacific, and why we need to understand the complexities of them more. So starting with this question, however, the general answer is yes. We did consider that it could support sustainable livelihoods and that it was contributing positively to livelihoods, but only for some people in some communities and not in isolation of other development initiatives. So just introducing tourism is not the answer. There need to be broader development activities to improve infrastructure, address issues of food security and poverty and access to markets and so forth, to help make it more tenable in the long run. So the summary, the sort of conclusions from our results, one key one is that understanding the role of social capital in the adaptation process and its distribution within communities is really important, especially in isolated communities where this type of capital, other types of capital are really limited. So this type of capital is really the fabric that holds the society together and also that governs natural resource use. So understanding that that is something that is going to both influence the outcomes of your initiative, but also could potentially be affected by your initiative is really, really important. So also working with a local context. So understanding what people are doing already, what their values, needs, and visions for the future are is really important, so that the alternative livelihood initiative, and this doesn't just apply for tourism, but that it really fits in with what's already happening. And there's a movement away now from really talking about alternative livelihoods and talking about, well, is that always what we need to do? Or should we potentially be enhancing livelihoods that are already existing and making them more effective and sustainable and more productive? And maybe diversification shouldn't be focused at the household level, and we should be focusing it more on a sort of community or landscape level and so forth. But that's another story. Also, it's important to consider the relationship with other livelihood activities, as I said. So this landscape approach, understanding that things like logging and oil palm and whatever else is happening, people are engaging in that. It's affecting the natural environment. It's affecting the society. They're all going to play off of each other. And this was a mistake that we made in this project, and a lesson that I learned that I will carry through into future research, is that we didn't really consider that enough. And in Bayer, for example, where one of the places we were working, a lot of the communities upstream over the course of our project got involved in logging, and there was also a lot of illegal logging activity going on and sort of land grabbing, and this had a massive impact on the river system and a massive impact on the black bass, to the extent that the sports fishing operator was really in a predicament and worried, and currently is worried, that he might not be able to continue his business there, because the environment has become so trashed and turbid and the black bass are just not there anymore. So had we thought about sort of extending our scope further upstream and incorporating the potential for these impacts into our project, maybe we could have helped to ameliorate the outcome, or maybe not. But I think we should have considered it to begin with. Also, locally relevant capacity building is important. So building human capital. And again, there tends to be a really strong assumption around the idea that people just need to learn how to become tour guides, or they need to learn how to open small businesses. But there might be other more nuanced needs that they have that you need to listen and let people tell you what they need. So things like us learning that people wanted to learn more about sanitation, and that people wanted to learn more about sustainable fishing and so forth. And these types of things are going to play into the bigger picture and make tourism more successful and make your alternative livelihood initiative more successful. So understanding what people want to learn is really important. Basic infrastructure, market access, and high dependence on dwindling fisheries resources all challenge the success of these initiatives. And this means it's important to recognize that livelihood challenges cannot be resolved by tourism alone. And I know, again, I'm preaching to the converted here, and that this narrative is probably not something that we adhere to, but it's certainly very prevalent in the sort of broader aid world and sort of alternative livelihood practitioner type of field. And again, it's changing, but it's still pretty prevalent. All right, so I'm going to finish off with just briefly addressing this question of why tourism alternative livelihood initiatives often fail in small scale fishing communities. And these are just a few bullet points that reflect where my thinking is going as a result of the work that I've done, the experience I've had so far, and also reading the literature from other colleagues who are working in this space. One reason is overly simplistic expectations about how communities will engage with new economic opportunities. So just wanting to make money and be engaged in other things doesn't mean that it's going to work. It's a lot more complicated than that. Another reason being that social capital considerations often take a backseat to other activities, such as building human and financial capital. It's much easier and more tangible to throw money at something and to put some training programs in place. And where these are obviously really valuable, it's also really important to consider how this is going to affect the society or the community that you're working in. And social capital, as I said, is really, really important for the social fabric of a community, and also in governing how they manage natural resources and so forth. So there is research out there that's shown that money in new markets can actually degrade social capital. And this is particularly true in cases where you have communities that haven't been exposed to Western financial systems or Western culture and so forth. So bearing in mind that this can actually change a society and create problems in a society that will then be counterproductive and jeopardize your initiative is really important. And finally, this sort of feeds into that point as well. Isolated communities may have low resilience to socioeconomic change. And this has also been shown through research in the Pacific in particular. There is a lot of work, a lot of sort of emphasis on resilience to climate change and environmental change. And communities in the Pacific, where they are certainly vulnerable, have been experiencing very dynamic, changing environments for centuries and adapting to them. But what they haven't experienced, a lot of them, is Western culture and globalization, and they've been very, very isolated socially. So their ability to adapt to those changes, they're perhaps more fragile in the face of those changes, or as fragile. And it's, I think that's something that sometimes gets forgotten with, if you look at that World Bank report on how much tourism is going to be flowing into the Pacific, this is a really important consideration for that type of change. So with that, I'm all done, and I will take any questions, and I'll stop sharing my screen. Thank you, everyone.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Amy, for a super, super thought-provoking presentation. I'd really like to open the floor for questions. Yeah, everybody that's been listening in, please jump in with any questions that you have. And perhaps while you're thinking, I may throw a few at Amy, because I've certainly got lots after that presentation.
Go for it.
I mean, I've got a few questions that are more sort of clarification based and just things that I'm interested in terms of certain aspects, but a few of the questions I've got are a bit bigger, so I'll throw them out at the moment. This is obviously really applied research, and I'm just wondering how this research is being used, I guess, for the communities that you went and undertook the research in. Is the findings of the research being taken forward? How is it influencing the potential for sports fishing development?
That's such a good question. That's the $1 million question, isn't it? So I suppose there's two ways that we tried to make it have an impact. And again, it's very hard to measure that impact, and I'll explain why in a minute. But one way was that we worked very closely with the sports fishing operator, and he was engaged with the whole process, and he was very motivated to sort of, he had a very strong connection with the community from childhood, and was very motivated to make things work for them and to understand what was working for them and what wasn't, and so forth. And so he certainly became more informed about what was happening in the communities, and as a result of that, was able to, I suppose, be more understanding and adapt his business accordingly. But it was mostly pretty positive. So it almost confirmed that he was going along the right path. But I think that's important, right? And the other thing was that it encouraged the communities to sort of talk about themselves and talk about their visions and think about how this fit in with their broader vision, which perhaps they hadn't really discussed before. And they came up with some really interesting new ideas that I didn't share. For example, the community that was suffering sort of problems from logging and so forth, they have a really beautiful lodge that they manage themselves, and that's vacant a lot of the year. And they suggested that after we'd been out there multiple times, they said, oh, we really love having scientists and people from JCU here, and maybe you could bring students out to do sort of field courses and so forth. And so that's something that we're actually actively exploring, because that would be an additional income source for them. So the National Fisheries Authority, they are using our information to develop a sports fishery management plan, but things in PNG are tricky, and there's been a lot of political changes over the course of our project, a lot of changes that have kind of, and the logging and those sorts of things that have impeded our ability to really move it forward. But it has also led to the funding of another project that is going to be working around trying to actually use the results that we've generated through this project and other related projects and put them into action and actually use them to create impact. So that's kind of a next phase that ACR is funding through that research. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's a work in progress.
Yeah, I think a lot of these things always are, aren't they? You can't just solve all the problems with one research project.
Yeah.
Natasha.
Hi, Natasha.
Hi, Amy.
How's it going?
Hi, Karen. Yeah, good, thanks. Sorry, completely missed the time difference and missed most of all of your presentation. But
oh dear, it's all right.
Sorry about that. I'll follow up with you afterwards. But I just wanted to make a comment. It was really great to see your paper a couple of weeks ago when this announcement came around about this seminar, and it's really relevant to what's happening here in the Northern Territory in Arnhem Land, because Indigenous rights have been recognised in the intertidal zone, which means that there's a big push now on developing Indigenous engagement in fisheries and recreational fishing tourism. And so that's being led by the Northern Land Council. So I think there's some really great lessons and learnings from the work that you've been doing in Papua New Guinea that are very relevant to Northern Australia and particularly the Northern Territory. So yeah, I'd like to talk about that with you.
Yeah,
offline.
I'd love to talk about that for sure.
Because it also seems in one of the courses that I teach, we try and look at case studies of Indigenous, enterprise development and look at tourism and look at other enterprises, and it seems like things like fishing tourism in the Indigenous context is probably, I don't know whether you could say less successful or delivering less benefits perhaps or opportunities than say cultural tourism, where Indigenous people are able to make a supplementary livelihood or run a business which is based on that sharing their culture and knowledge and with tourists. And there's a couple of really interesting successful examples here, but again there's sort of there's constraints and opportunities and strengths and weaknesses that get developed through these different types of enterprises. So it's just wanted to make that comment, and it's really great to see this work happening in places like Papua New Guinea.
Awesome. Well, I'm keen to learn more for sure.
Yeah.
Thanks, Natasha.
Thanks.
We have a question from Georgina in the chat. Georgina, would you like to unmute yourself and ask Amy that question?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I'm not on video. Thanks, Amy. That was a really interesting talk. I just had a quick question, wondering if you could talk more a little bit about how practitioners and policymakers could take into consideration social capital a little more in what they do? Like, for example, would you suggest building social capital or?
Yeah, oh gosh, that's another $1 million question. So I think, I'm not sure, I don't feel, I've thought a lot about this, and I don't feel as a practitioner, like I sort of consider myself on the bridge of practitioner versus researcher, like, because I am so applied. But I think that building social capital is really, really complicated because it's something that happens, you know, over a long period of time, and it's so culturally specific and it's so nuanced and all of that, that I'm not sure if it's realistic to actually suggest that we can build social capital as it exists in the community, but perhaps you could create more forms of social capital through bringing people together in your projects, you know, holding workshops and forming committees and getting people to talk to each other who hadn't otherwise talked to each other, and building networks and so forth. So, but I don't know, I don't think that that's necessarily the role of a researcher in sort of our field. And I would be inclined to say that if you want to do that, you need to bring in an expert in potentially conflict management or leadership development or those sorts of things, which is something that I'm doing in the next project that I'm implementing in Solomon Islands. Is I've got someone who specializes in actually bringing people together and forming committees and understanding those sort of social dynamics and getting people to communicate and collaborate and build networks. So I think having someone in a project who knows how to do that kind of stuff, and that can be kind of I suppose a product of your project, is really important. But with respect to taking social capital into account, I think that is just a question of adding it into your monitoring and evaluation. And we don't really know how to measure it that well either. Like, I'm not going to lie and say that the measures that we used were by any means perfect. And Georgie, you and I have used, you know, similar social capital measures and talked about in our papers and talked about how to make them better. But I think, you know, incorporating that and monitoring it and understanding it and in your projects is also really, really important. And it's not done enough. We tend to focus on these sort of more tangible things that we know we can measure.
No, that's so true. Thank you.
No worries. Oh, Karen, you're on mute.
Thank you. I always forget to turn myself off mute. I see there's a really interesting question from Bethany in the chat as well. Bethany, do you want to unmute yourself and ask that question? Or?
Yeah. Amy, I finally got to see you present after all this time. That's really interesting. I just wanted to say, I found that graph with the number of people that wanted to engage in tourism. Do you think that's going to dramatically decrease now because of COVID? And then what do you think the effects of that will be in areas where tourism is considered like a primary livelihood opportunity, or say in PNG where so much work and resources have gone into actually building up the tourism industry?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think it's a difficult question, because if tourism isn't happening, if it wasn't going to happen in the community, we wouldn't have been asking. And in that context, I suppose if you were asking people who have been engaged in tourism and were completely dependent on it and had that taken away from them, or they'd experienced that in their community, then they're going to be scarred and they're not going to want to be reliant on it anymore. And certainly I went to a really interesting meeting recently with the sort of Ministry of Antigua and Barbuda, based in the Caribbean, that used to be like completely dependent on marine tourism. And they were talking about building a center for the blue economy. And I sort of went in there thinking, with my sort of tourism hat on, and thinking, oh yes, you can make all this money off these types of tourism and blah, blah, blah. And they just were like, no, we're not interested. We never want to become dependent on tourism ever again, because this can't happen. Like, we've been so scarred by being fully dependent on this industry. So I think it's making a lot of countries that have become very dependent on it think again and realize that they can't, because tourism is one of those things that tends to just kind of take over, and people just become completely reliant on it, and then they just get crushed. That's not really the case in PNG at this stage. But yeah, I don't really know how it's going to play out, but I think it's going to be interesting to see what people come up with in the future, and what sort of padding they put in place to avoid becoming fully dependent on tourism, so that this type of thing doesn't happen again.
Do you think in terms of research then there'll also be a move towards not just focusing on tourism or even small scale agriculture where there's been issues with like value chains, but to multiple different livelihood opportunities to kind of increase the resilience of these communities?
Well, if I have anything to do with it, it will.
Yeah.
That's pretty much the focus of my research
Yeah.
for the rest of my life. No, definitely. I hope to see that. And I think, you know, I certainly learned a valuable lesson. It took me a long time, but in this, you know, seeing how the tourism in this one particular community has almost been like, the black bass tourism has pretty much been shut down because of logging upstream, just made me realize like the penny really dropped. I thought we've got to look at this in a bigger context. And yeah, certainly aquaculture is the same.
Yeah. Thank you.
No worries.
Lovely, thank you so much. I see that we're very quickly approaching 2 o'clock, or 2 o'clock our time, I should say. So what I might do is draw this to a close, and say thank you very much once again to Amy for such an interesting and thought-provoking talk, and hopefully not only from this group of people that have been here to listen live, but also from people that will get the chance to view this video on the MarSocSci website. Hopefully you will be inundated with lots of queries about all sorts of things.
Oh dear, well, no, that would be nice, yeah.
And
Thank
thanks
you
again so much for giving a talk today.
Thanks, Karen, and thanks everyone.
Lovely. Thank you, everyone. See you later.